When I first pulled this case, I thought it was another North Shore situation that spiraled. Lynn, Salem, Revere. Shootings that don't get solved, names that pop up and then disappear. That's normal, unfortunately. But then I hit the extradition section, and that stopped me. Because nobody gets extradited from Honduras over street-level bullshit. So I went back to the beginning. Not skimming, not headline reading. I reread everything, slowly. And once you do that, you can see exactly where this stops being a gang case and turns into something the federal government decides it has to finish. The Trinitarios aren't some mystery group that popped up overnight. They don't start in Massachusetts, and they don't even start on the street. They come out of New York prisons in the 1990s, built around hierarchy, internal discipline, and enforcement. By the time they're operating in New England, they're already an organisation, not a crew. That distinction matters. Because in organisations like this, not everyone knows everyone, but everyone knows the rules. Boston isn't separate from the North Shore. Lawrence isn't separate from Lynn. Maine isn't some distant outpost. Different cities, same structure. And once you start lining up the indictments, you see the overlap. The same phones, the same cars, the same weapons, and the same names appearing in different places at different times, doing different roles. That's not coincidence, that's continuity. Every Trinitarios region has a supreme. In Massachusetts, that role sat with Emmanuel Paula Cabral. Not a mythic figure, not some flashy boss, a coordinator, someone who authorizes retaliation, settles disputes, and decides when something's handled internally and when it's enforced violently. This matters because once leadership authorizes violence, the government stops seeing individuals. It starts seeing policy. This doesn't start with disrespect, it starts with money. Up to this point, nothing violent has happened yet, and that's important. Because when people look back at cases like this, they usually start at the first shooting. But by the time a gun comes out, the decision has already been made. The real beginning is quieter. Spreadsheets, messages, balances, and the slow realization that something in the system isn't working the way it's supposed to. There's a moment most organizations hit where identity stops being the main thing. Colors matter less, reputation matters less, and money starts to matter more. That's the phase the Trinitarios are in by the early 2020s, at least in Massachusetts and the surrounding region. The paperwork doesn't describe corner-level dealing. It describes something closer to a supply operation. Fentanyl pills, manufactured locally, packaged consistently, moved in volume, and redistributed across the North Shore and into Maine. That's not chaos, that's logistics. Once you cross into logistics, your problems change. Instead of asking, who disrespected who, you start asking, where's the product and where's the money? And those questions don't stay unanswered for long. Fentanyl doesn't behave like older drug markets. Margins are tighter, risk is higher, and losses compound faster. If a batch goes missing or doesn't sell, the damage ripples upstream immediately. So when the filings start referencing missing product and unpaid balances, that's not background noise. That's the sound of a system under stress. And when systems under stress don't self-correct, they get corrected. Every illegal operation still runs on trust. Someone fronts product, someone promises to pay later, and someone vouches. As long as money flows back, nobody asks too many questions. But once it doesn't, trust collapses fast. The paperwork shows increasing pressure through messages. Not emotional outbursts, but reminders. Amounts owed, deadlines implied, references to past arrangements. This is the stage where leadership still hopes the problem resolves quietly, because violence is expensive. Violence draws attention. Violence creates witnesses, and violence invites law enforcement. Before anyone gets hurt, there's usually a period where leadership tries to fix the problem administratively. That's what you're seeing here. An administrative failure doesn't look dramatic. It looks like delays, excuses, partial payments. But inside an organization built on enforcement, that's poison. If one person can fall behind without consequence, others notice. If leadership tolerates it, authority erodes. And once authority erodes, the organization becomes unstable. That's the point where leadership has to choose between short-term peace and long-term control. Historically, control wins. The filings show a clear transition. At first, messages are about money. Then they were about locating people. Then they were about weapons. That progression matters. You don't jump straight to violence unless earlier tools fail. This isn't impulsive behaviour. It's escalation. And escalation follows a script. One thing the paperwork makes clear is that geography is flexible. People move between Lynn, Salem, Lawrence, and Boston without much friction. That's not accidental. It means the organisation isn't anchored to one neighbourhood. It's anchored to routes, cars, phones, meeting points. If one area gets hot, activity shifts. That flexibility is what allows organisations like this to survive early law enforcement pressure. And it's also what eventually draws federal attention. Because once activity crosses jurisdictions consistently, local police stop being enough. At some point, leadership decides that the debt won't resolve quietly. This is the moment everything changes, even though nothing visible happens yet. Weapons get discussed, people get assigned, and movement gets planned. Not everyone involved knows the full picture. They don't need to, they just need to know their role. That's how enforcement works without chaos. When violence finally happens, it's not random. It's targeted. Not necessarily at the original debtor, but at the structure around them. That's how enforcement sends a message without saying a word. And that's also how violence spreads faster than intended, because once one side responds, the other side has to respond back. At that point, the original issue, the debt, almost doesn't matter anymore. Now it's about reputation. After the first violent act, something shifts. The organisation is no longer trying to recover money. It's trying to preserve authority. Recovering money is negotiable. Preserving authority is not. Once you cross that line, escalation becomes predictable. And predictable escalation is exactly what prosecutors look for. The filings don't just focus on guns, they focus on phones, group chats, encrypted platforms, language patterns. Because guns explain what happened. Phones explain why. Messages show who asked, who approved, and who confirmed. That chain is everything. It's the difference between a crime and a conspiracy. As violence increases, so does internal discipline. Rules tighten, access narrows, and information becomes compartmentalized. This isn't panic, it's adaptation. Organizations that don't adapt collapse quickly. Organizations that do adapt last longer, but they also leave clearer trails. More messages, more coordination, more evidence. At this stage, you might wonder why leadership doesn't just shut things down. The answer is simple. They can't. Once money starts flowing through multiple layers, stopping the pipeline creates more problems than continuing it. People upstream still expect payment. People downstream still expect supply. Shutting it down creates new debts and new enemies, so instead, leadership tries to manage the fallout while keeping the operation alive. That balancing act rarely works. By late 2023, the paperwork shows a system under constant strain. Violence has started, but it hasn't resolved anything. Money is still an issue, authority is still being tested, and the more violence occurs, the harder it becomes to step back. At this point, nobody is really in control anymore. They're just reacting to the last move. That's when mistakes start happening. Mistakes aren't always sloppy. Sometimes they're systematic. Reusing phones, meeting in familiar locations, recording behaviour that should never be recorded. These aren't rookie errors. They're the result of operating under pressure for too long. And pressure creates patterns. Patterns are what federal cases are built on. By now, the original debt barely matters. The money is gone, the relationships are burned, and the focus has shifted. Now it's about dominance, and dominance doesn't de-escalate on its own. Once multiple acts of violence occur, leadership no longer has the option to walk things back. Every decision after that is defensive. Cover tracks, limit exposure, control information. This is the stage where people start thinking about exit strategies. Not for the operation, but for themselves. And that's how you end up with people leaving the country. From the outside, this looks like chaos. From the inside, it looks like a failing system trying to stabilize itself. That's the distinction most crime coverage misses. This isn't about people losing control. It's about people trying to regain it and failing. By the end of this phase, everything is in motion. Violence has started, authority is being challenged, and law enforcement attention is increasing. What comes next isn't surprising, but the speed, coordination, and consequences are. Because the next phase isn't about money anymore, it's about survival. Once violence starts, people expect it to look loud and chaotic, and sometimes it is. But in this case, the paperwork shows something different, something quieter and more deliberate. The first shooting doesn't feel like a loss of control. It feels like a test. November 2023. Salem. On the surface, it looks like another shooting tied to street conflict. But when you line up the timeline, the story changes. Phones light up beforehand. Messages reference firearms. Vehicles move, reposition, and wait. Then, right before the shooting, the phones go quiet. That silence matters. It's not panic, it's coordination. When prosecutors talk about intent, this is what they mean. Not what someone says afterward, not what they claim they were feeling. But what happens beforehand. Planning leaves a footprint. And this footprint is clean enough that it doesn't read like improvisation. It reads like execution. After the first shooting, there's a brief window where things could still stop. That's the moment most people never see, because it doesn't make headlines. Leadership assesses what happened, who was involved, and how it was perceived internally. The question isn't, was this wrong? The question is, did this restore control? And based on what comes next, the answer was no. December 2023 is where the case shifts permanently. Pizza Hut parking lot. Multiple people shot. Everyone survives. That detail matters more than it seems. Because survival means the message didn't land the way leadership needed it to. And when enforcement doesn't land, it escalates. What follows isn't emotional or chaotic. It's organised. Encrypted group chats light up. Rules get laid out. Who's active, who's not, who's allowed to move, who isn't. This isn't street-level decision-making. This is internal governance under pressure. Within a day, retaliation isn't suggested. It's approved. That language matters. Approval implies authority, hierarchy, and consent from the top. The next shooting involves automatic gunfire. Dozens of shell casings. 2 people dead. At that point, this stops looking like things getting out of hand. It starts looking like enforcement. Automatic fire isn't an accident, conversion switches don't appear by chance, and you don't deploy them unless you believe the situation justifies the risk. When I hit the surveillance breakdown from the Wendy's shooting, I had to stop, because the shooter doesn't get back into the driver's seat. He gets into the back. Driver stays driver. Shooter stays shooter. Exit happens cleanly. That detail is small, but it changes everything. I remember thinking this was just another messy drive-by, until I saw that. That's when it stopped looking like chaos and started looking like procedure. Procedure is what separates crimes from systems. Anyone can act impulsively. Systems assign roles. And once roles are assigned, responsibility becomes distributed. That's why these cases are so hard to defend. Nobody has to confess. The structure confesses for them. As violence escalates, so does documentation. Ironically, people record themselves with weapons, they post videos, they send messages confirming availability, readiness, loyalty. At the time, it probably feels like confidence. In retrospect, it's evidence. You don't document behaviour like this if you think the consequences stay local. That's the tell. By this point, federal jurisdiction isn't a possibility anymore. It's inevitable. Automatic weapons cross a line that local cases rarely survive. Add multiple shootings, multiple jurisdictions, and coordinated cleanup, and the case stops being about individual acts. It becomes about pattern recognition. Cleanup is where intent gets locked in. Cars get cleaned, plates get swapped, weapons get buried, phones get ditched. This isn't fear, it's process. Fear is sloppy, process is careful, and careful behaviour after violence tells prosecutors this organisation isn't going to stop on its own. At the same time, the internal environment tightens. Information gets restricted. Fewer people are looped in. Mistakes become punishable. This is what organisations do when they feel pressure. They contract. But contraction has a side effect. It concentrates responsibility. Fewer people make more decisions, and those decisions become easier to trace. What's striking is how quickly the original issue disappears from view. The debt that started this is barely referenced anymore. At this stage, violence isn't about recovering anything, it's about maintaining credibility. And credibility, once challenged publicly, can't be restored quietly. That's how escalation becomes self-sustaining. The filings show law enforcement slowly catching up, not through luck, but through accumulation. Surveillance here, phone data there, a cooperating witness filling in gaps. No single piece, breaks the case open. It's the overlap that matters. Same people, same methods, same language. Over and over. By late December, early January, it's clear this isn't going to burn out on its own. Too many people are involved. Too much has already happened. And once bodies are involved, the government's tolerance for ambiguity disappears. At that point, the question isn't whether charges are coming, it's how far they're going to go. This is the moment where some people start thinking ahead. Not about the next move, but about exit. And exit doesn't always mean another city. Sometimes it means another country. Because if you believe the case is already built, distance feels like the only remaining leverage. That decision to leave doesn't reduce exposure, it increases it. Because leaving tells prosecutors you know what's coming. And knowledge is a form of intent. By the end of this phase, the violence has done its job internally, but it's also done something else. It's unified the evidence. What were once separate incidents now read like chapters in the same story. And once a case reads like a story, the ending is usually written by the same people. Once people start leaving the country, the case enters a different phase. Running isn't evidence by itself, but it changes how prosecutors read everything that came before. Distance doesn't erase the paper trail, it sharpens it. And when someone tied to a violent conspiracy leaves the United States after coordinated shootings, the government doesn't interpret that as coincidence. It interprets it as awareness. Honduras isn't symbolic, it's practical. It's a place people believe puts space between them and the system. But extradition only happens when prosecutors believe the case is already complete. Not just strong, but finished. It means they're confident that bringing someone back won't weaken anything. It will only formalise it. That's why extradition is such a clear signal of intent from the government. It's expensive, it's diplomatic, it's slow, and it's unnecessary unless the charges are airtight. So when you see extradition pursued here, it tells you prosecutors aren't worried about gaps. They're worried about closure. This is also where RICO fully comes into focus. People hear RICO and think it's about stacking charges. It's not. It's about telling a coherent story on paper. A story where individual crimes make sense only when viewed together. The government isn't trying to prove one shooting. It's proving continuity, that the organisation existed before the violence, survived the violence, and adapted because of the violence. That's why the indictments feel long. That's why they include things people dismiss as extra. Robberies, stolen phones, weapons caches, lottery tickets, crypto wallets. None of that is filler. It's connective tissue. It shows how money kept moving, how weapons stayed accessible, and how leadership functioned under pressure. RICO doesn't care about drama. It cares about structure. Who had authority? Who asked for approval? Who gave it? Who carried out orders? And who benefited? When cooperating witnesses describe the same hierarchy, and the digital evidence matches their accounts, prosecutors don't need speculation. They already have corroboration. What's striking is how ordinary the infrastructure looks. The same apps everyone uses, the same cars people drive every day, the same restaurants people eat at. Nothing about it looks exotic or cinematic. That's part of why cases like this go unnoticed for so long. They don't announce themselves, they accumulate quietly. By the time federal charges land, the violence is already over. That's another thing people misunderstand. The government doesn't rush in during chaos. It waits for patterns to stabilise. It waits until behaviour becomes predictable. And predictability is what allows prosecutors to map intent without guessing. Once the indictments drop, the case stops being about individual defendants and starts being about precedent. This isn't just a Massachusetts story, it's a blueprint for how local crews operating inside national structures lose control of risk. When violence becomes policy, instead of reaction, the system responds in kind. The federal government doesn't step in to calm things down, it steps in to end them. Not quickly, not cleanly, but definitively. That's why these cases feel overwhelming when you finally see them laid out. They're not meant to scare the public, they're meant to withstand years of scrutiny. What makes this unsettling isn't the scale of violence, it's the proximity. Same streets, same parking lots, same routines. The only difference between this and normal life is the paperwork. Paperwork most people never read, and once you do read it, you can't unsee how methodical escalation actually is. This isn't a story about shock value or spectacle, it's a story about accumulation, about how small decisions compound until the system can't ignore them anymore, about how authority gets tested reinforced, and eventually exposed. And about how once that exposure happens, distance doesn't protect anyone. Once you see how this one escalated, you stop asking why it got so bad. You start wondering how many others followed the same path and never made the news. How many cases are still mid-escalation, still quiet, still unresolved. That's the part that sticks with you. This is the underground files, and the paperwork never lies.